Welcome back to our second session of the day for the Lebanese conference. It's titled Political Parallels and Economic Intersections. I'm Alejandro Velasco, as I mentioned before, for those of you who weren't here. So I'll briefly introduce our panelists for this session. They'll each have about 10 to 12 minutes. Some of them will have less because they're co-written papers. And then we'll have comments from Arang, and then we'll open it up for discussion from the audience, okay? So that should work out well. So our first panelist is Paul Amar, who is professor in the Global Studies Department at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And he is a political scientist and anthropologist. He currently serves as director of the MA and PhD programs in global studies. He's worked as a journalist in Cairo, a police reformer, sexuality rights activist in Rio de Janeiro, and as a conflict resolution and economic development specialist at the UN. His latest book is The Security Archipelago, and it was awarded the Charles Taylor Award for Best Book of the Year in 2014 by the Interpretive Methods section of the American Political Science Association. Kaveh Ehsani is an assistant professor of international studies and director of graduate studies at DePaul University. He's been a long-standing member of the editorial boards of Gov Togo and in Tehran, and of Middle East Report of MERIP, and more recently of Iranian studies. And he's a regular media commentator about domestic and international Iranian politics. His research focuses on the historical and contemporary impact of oil on society and politics, the urban process and spatial change in Middle East cities, and in the political economy of geopolitics of post-revolutionary Iran. Most recently, he's co-editor of Working for Oil, Comparative Social Histories of Labor in the Global Oil Industry. Cecilia Baeza is a professor of international relations at the Pontificia Universidade Católica de São Paulo, Brazil. She received her PhD in political science from Sciences Po in Paris. She's co-founder of RIMAL, which is a network of researchers on the links between Latin America and the Middle East. And the focus of her research is Arab diasporas in Latin America. Her work has appeared in the Journal of Palestine Studies, the International Politics of Arab Spring, Raison Politique, Meridianos, Revista Iberoamericana de Filosofía, among others. Paulo Pinto is professor of anthropology and director of the Center of Middle East Studies at the Universidade Federal Fluminense in Brazil. His areas of interest include embodiment and the construction of religious subjectivities, ethnicity, and religious nationalism. He's done field work in Syria's Sufi communities as well as in Muslim communities in Brazil. And his work has appeared in Social Compass, Middle East Critique, Sufism Today, Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa and the Middle East, and he's co-editor of Ethnographies of Islam, Ritual Performances and Everyday Practices. Finally, for our panelists, Paulo Farah is professor of Arab and African Studies at the Universidade de São Paulo, and he's a director of African Research Center at USP, and a director of Bibliaspa. His work focuses on the Middle East and Africa, Orientalism, Arabic literature, and on manuscripts. Finally, our discussant is Arang Kesavarshan. Why do I keep getting it wrong? I'm so sorry. Is associate professor of Middle East and Islamic Studies here at NYU, and he's also an editor of MERIP. His research focuses on comparative Middle Eastern politics with a focus on issues related to political economy, transnationalism, and contentious politics in authoritarian context. His book, Bazaar and State in Iran, The Politics of the Tehran Marketplace, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2007. So, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Amar.
Thank you very much. I'm so thrilled to be here at my alma mater where I did my PhD, and to have people like Lisa Dugan, who served on my committee, and Ella Shahat, who helped to shepherd my book, The Security Archipelago, to Duke University Press, and to be a part of the O Infame Tres Paulinhos here, three Pauls who work on Middle East-Brazil relations. This is, I think, the first time in a while we're allowed to be in the same room. So, so I'm really thrilled to be a part of this conversation. Going to read some of this, which has been published by NACLA, some of this article, which I don't usually read, but because there's so many, kind of data points and events and project specificities, I'm going to try to stick to the text a little bit, and then when I'm out of time, I'll jump out of it. Here are some of the questions I'm going to be addressing, in particular looking at 21st century military capitalism in Egypt and Brazil, looking at trying to think about the political economic infrastructure behind some of these crises, the return of certain kinds of authoritarianism and social violence, looking specifically at how to map the spatial formations and materialities of new forms of oligarchical class formations, particularly as in their gender and race components, and also looking to see how the legitimation process of this runs not just through capital but through race, sexuality, and space in particular ways. So, in the center of the Middle East, Egypt's military and security forces boldly and unapologetically stand at the commanding heights of the economy today. This year, the Egyptian armed forces gathered the country's largest domestic contractors to complete the Al Maza mega project, featuring the country's largest luxury hotel resort and tourist city, whose entrance will be dominated by a gigantic gleaming sculpture of a black diamond. This kind of represents this mix of extractivism fantasies around diamond and oil and the power of the military itself as an icon of capital extractivism and luxury tourist city development. In a parallel effort, since 2016, the Egyptian Armed Forces Engineering Authority has shifted away from dependence on investors such as the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia toward channeling Egyptian state funds to Chinese contractors. Today, Shanghai's China Fortune Land Development and China State Construction Engineering Corporation are building the 20-plus skyscrapers that will comprise the central business district of Egypt's so-called new administrative capital. The Chinese corporations will build the high-speed train that will link the CBD to the outskirts of Cairo, while making quick progress on a 345-meter office tower that will be the tallest in Africa. Meanwhile, contested reports describe the construction of an immense office complex, the Octagon, which, not just the Pentagon, it's the Octagon, which will serve as a new home for the Egyptian military. These projects taken together, as noted in the international contractors publication Construction Weekly, these Egyptian military projects aim to carry out the vision of the ancient trade route of the Silk Road, with a bold plan to connect China to the entirety of Asia and the eastern parts of Africa and Europe through 6 routes. The project will symbolize Egypt and China's mutual cooperation for future generations. I'll show you a bit this route, the new Silk Road, and how important it is, how China's plan for the new Silk Road, which is a water route actually, and it depends upon the transformation of Cairo into a mega port that will build 9 Dubais connecting Cairo to the Suez Canal, and then on the other side, Saudi Arabia is building a brand new province slash fantasy country called Neo Mustaqbal, to create this massive port interchange for the new Silk Road. Anyway, it's worse than you could possibly imagine. In addition, late 2017, we're not going to Brazil yet, a part of Egypt's Central Intelligence Services, the Mukhabarat, purchased the country's largest private sector television stations, On TV, CBC, El Hayat, El Nahar, as well as popular newspapers Yom Sabah, as reported by Hassan Bahkat of the Madamasr. This remarkable deal of rather absolutist securitizing capitalism was made through the Mukhabarat's for-profit investment company, Eagle Capital, which is in league with the Falcon Corporation, a private security company run by former military and interior officers and ex-police officers. This concerning blend of military capital, Mukhabarat entrepreneurialism has reached new peaks. So how does the capital incursion of the Egyptian military compare to other militaries in top developing countries around the world? In Brazil, unlike in Egypt, the uniformed armed forces are prohibited from direct involvement in private sector projects. However, they are critically important to creating capital, opening new markets for military engineering technologies and arms sales, and anchoring new investment developments around 21st century mega projects. This provides a useful point of comparison between the Middle Eastern country of Egypt and the South American country of Brazil. For example, the armed forces in Brazil build highways that penetrate the Amazon region to bring settlement and investment, including a Zona Franca, a free trade zone in the Amazon, and they have a series of military-led biodiversity, reforestation / environmentalism and mall building projects called O Verde no Verde, meaning the green uniform people in the green pseudo-eco landscape economy of the Amazon. Meanwhile, the Deodoro Army Base in Rio served as a major hub for the 2016 Olympic Games. During the Games, the military produced television campaigns featuring soldiers and officers, many of whom won Olympic medals, as ideal champion athletes, heroic agents of public security, and advocates of patriotic entrepreneurialism. So this is part of that Olympic campaign. Those lovely security officials are providing you reassurance that the heroic aims of brotherhood and sport will be safe for all. Okay, so in this context, a new set of military-run secondary schools have opened across the country in Brazil that teach non-partisan, purely Brazilian. The word purely Brazilian has now become a fascist slogan. Explicitly aiming to discredit the human rights orientation and anti-racist character of the Brazil school curriculum established by the 1988 Constitution at the end of the military dictatorship. As we have been talking about today, Jair Bolsonaro, a presidential candidate from the far right, an explicitly pro-torture populist, former military officer, and proud neo-Pentecostalist, has given speeches and hosted rallies at these new nationalistic army schools as part of his campaign. That's the Deodoro Army Base during the Olympics, and how it was kind of refashioned as this kind of global city for Rio's military to articulate to global capital and new models of futuristic military statism. So also China comes back into this formula in Brazil as well as it does in Egypt. For Brazil's military engineers have established large-scale partnerships with military industries across Africa, and in 2015 ratified cooperation with the Chinese People's Liberation Army for technology transfers. Joint Brazil-China military maneuvers began in 2011, a year that Chinese enterprises invested $11 billion in Brazil. And under the crunch of the draconian austerity the austerity government imposed by Michel Temer since the coup impeachment, there's been strong incentives to the armed forces to balance its books by expanding into the global free market of interstate arms sales, particularly to China itself. So this has become, Brazil's armed forces selling large amounts of arms to China for use in Africa and its development projects has become a major key of the economic recovery agenda of Brazil and its austerity politics. So this is part of the dark side of South-South politics and new imperialism that has virtually nothing to do with the United States or the global North. China, Africa, Brazil, military. As these cases demonstrate, militarized state institutions and security agencies around the world, there's the military school that Jair was speaking at. As these cases demonstrate, militarized state institutions and security agencies around the world are assuming new or newly expanded roles as investors, contractors, and even corporate profiteers. They are advancing in areas formerly associated with private sector businesses and non-military dimensions of the public sector. To be sure, the phenomenon of military interest driving structural changes in capitalism is not new. In the 20th century, during periods of rapid industrialization and decolonization, military institutions played key roles as spurs of economic development as partners in the business sector across the globe. So then I go into the kind of history of talking about military authoritarianism and developmentalism in Latin America in particular, but why we need to update this in terms of seeing how the new horizontal political economies in the global south and new forms of mega contracting attached to what I call parapopulist ideologies, which I will jump ahead to. I also cite the large body of scholarship that does already exist amongst brave researchers working in Egypt and Brazil on these cases, and particularly I suggest the new book by Zainab Majd that just came out 2 weeks after I finished this article about the military in Egypt. So what is new about this new set of transregional patterns of militarized capitalism? First, military forces now coordinate domestic building efforts, public security, and social displacement, in addition to or instead of focusing primarily on preparing for external wars and defense of the country. Second, military capitalist relations now define state-linked investment initiatives in the global south. They capitalize on rivalries between Chinese companies and Persian Gulf sovereign fund investors in particular in both these sites, while US, Russian, British, German, and Italian arms contractors remain key kind of shuttles or wedges in these military economies. As the heads of these economy and governance agencies, should soldiers be seen as a part of the expansion of a public sector workers' rights agenda in this frame? Should profits created by the military coordinated mega projects be redistributed as public patrimony or recaptured as private wealth by oligarchs on top? So basic questions for the left, aside from the basic authoritarian frame, are really interesting in terms of soldiers as workers, in terms of redistribution of capital produced by mega projects led by the military. And then there's a history of the historical evolution of roles in the military in Egypt and in Brazil. Back to Egypt for a minute. Mega becomes the buzzword of the era. This term captured the phallic nationalism of its extreme projection discourse of the world's tallest, the world's biggest, the black diamond, the octagon. Egypt began scrambling to attract a more diverse portfolio of investors in attempt to avoid total dependence on Saudi Arabia, whose attempts to discipline Sisi grated on the Egyptian state. Saudi Arabia, for its part, began to concentrate its investments on its own mega project efforts, such as NEOM, the Neo Mustaqbal, whose first citizen was a lady robot who made a speech at the World Economic Forum advocating for a totally robotized female workforce for Neo Mustaqbal, which is kind of the Saudi province that's going to be part of this massive mega port of 25 million people from Egypt to Suez. Interestingly, Egyptian women, this is the other right-wing, non-robotic side of the way gender is appropriated in this project. Egyptian women business and media figures have featured as key policy leaders in Egypt, shaping and championing this process of economic militarization from the right, while serving as some of the most forceful members of El-Sisi's cabinet. These include Dalia Khorshid, former Minister of Investment and head of Eagle Capital, who engineered the recent media purchases by the Mukhabarat; Ghada Wali, the Social Solidarity Minister, who led a crackdown on unions and NGOs; Faiz al-Bulnaga, the Mubarak-era planning minister, who became El-Sisi's national security advisor and targeted political opposition; and Sahar Nasser, Minister of International Cooperation. So it's interesting, Egypt... 2 minutes, fine. So interesting that Egypt, one thing that's different about Egypt as opposed to Brazil or the United States or so many of these other para-populist regimes, is that rather than extinguishing the presence of women, women have actually been, right-wing state feminists have actually surged to the front and have been extremely visible, not just as symbols, but as really key figures welding the Mukhabarats with new forms of capital, with military capital in Egypt. And all these symbols of the eagle and the falcon are women-led initiatives with this highly militaristic, kind of badass agenda. So it's really fascinating how that Egypt is rather exceptional in this world of highly masculinized populists. So we got to jump to, the Brazil's thugolatry. I have to talk about that because this is part of the new wave of violence in Brazil. So the Brazil case reveals contradictions and trajectories of change that reflect regional questions in terms of militarized political economics more broadly. There's the new stuff in Egypt. There's the ministers under Sisi that are leading these efforts. Okay. In the lead up to the impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff in 2016, two kinds of securitization panic swept the nation. A corruption panic led by a handful of crusading jurists against elected political officials, and a crime panic unleashed by an explosive three-way governance rivalry between trafficker commandos, militarized police battalions, and vigilante militias. So now I'm getting into the kind of racial ideological structure behind this military capitalism. So this bears a structural resemblance to the security panic in Egypt that has targeted the Baltagi, the thug, as a displaced figure of terrorism and as the criminalization of popular sovereignty movements since the uprisings of 2011. In Brazil, the right wing launched accusations of bandidolatria, which is like the idolatrous worship of thugs and criminals, meaning racialized people, by the corrupt left. And this bandidolatria and the assassination of democracy, they actually use this term bandidolatria as an accusation post-mortem against Marielle Franco, who was assassinated by a death squad, a black lesbian political leader in the municipal government of Rio de Janeiro. They said she was a lover of bandits, so she must die by bandits. So this is this discourse of the idolatry for thugs, or the worship, the unjust worship of corrupt links to narco-traffic and the movements, community movements among racialized peoples is very much a discourse of state terror that builds on the worst of the racialization of the narco-traffic era and is infrastructurally driven by this new form of militarized capitalism. So I have to conclude. So the written version concludes on January 25th, 2018, when I finished the piece, which, as you know, the Saurat 25 Yanair, the revolution of January 25th is what we call the uprisings in Egypt in 2011. January 25th of this year, 7 years later, was like a specter that haunted the global kind of para-populist regime, in that it was that day in which they decided to jail President Lula and end his political candidacy for president. It was the day that they intimidated and forced the resignation of other candidates for president in Egypt from the left, Khaled Ali and 3 other military generals that were running against Sisi, like Sami Annen. So ending with this kind of moment in which we have, and then I didn't even know, but a week later, of course, Rio de Janeiro would be occupied by the military, and literally the military-run security regime, the first time since the dictatorship. And then a month later, 6 weeks later, we have the assassination of Marielle Franco by militarized police-linked death squad. So this model of military capitalism, of course, is not, I'm not stepping away from focusing on the securitization of subjects of race and sexuality and gender in these frameworks, but I think it's really important to see the infrastructure and economic interests that are behind this new kind of authoritarianism, which I call parapopulism, in order to underline that this is not the statist forms of populism that we saw in the 1930s through 50s in these 2 regions. Instead, it's a kind of paramilitarized, a kind of shadow state form of contractor-based and debt peddling and mega projects that are at the liminal margins of statist rule. Thank you very much.
So I'll be talking about oil, and title of my talk, which I ended up actually not writing, not submitting yet for in a written form for various reasons. One of which was that I kind of I came to the conclusion that it's actually quite difficult to make substantive comparisons between the way that oil has shaped politics and societies in Latin America and the Middle East. Not that there isn't a pattern, but part of the problem is that oil is often framed as a uniquely magical substance and commodity which by itself shapes societies, politics, and regions. There's a very prevalent set of theories, resource curse theories, which are kind of are floated about in various versions. Rentier state is more prevalent in the Middle East. Petro state is what Russia is being referred to nowadays. In the case of Africa, there's a vast literature that basically equates the politics that kind of oozes out of oil and shapes polities like Nigeria and other oil producers as enforcing violence and civil war and strife. So in some ways, the fact that oil is kind of reified as a substance that basically by itself magically reshapes polities and political relations is kind of very problematic in itself. So when you start to actually kind of compare and see what kind of patterns there are, you realize that, well, this is a very important industry. It's the most important global commodity traded worldwide. We live in a civilization based on oil. Its patterns of consumption, mass industrial production and consumption are shaped by fossil fuels one way or another. And of course, our planetary meltdown right now is kind of by and large shaped by this. But what kind of generalizations can we make? Those become a little bit more difficult, to be facile about and to generalize. So it's something that I think it's necessary to think about. So this is my attempt to kind of look at some patterns. One thing I'd like to say is that there's always this, oil appears as this, elusive magical substance that, has symbolized politically in people's imaginaries, especially in producer countries, as something that can, a substance that can bring about equitable national development, that it can be a shortcut to modernity through modernization, through states building vast projects that would benefit everybody, that would redistribute wealth, and kind of create a nation where wealth is shared by everyone. So, in some ways, oil has always had a moral economy attached to it. It's not just about the market. It's not just the performance of a sector or revenues coming out of an extractive industry. It's also much more this notion that this is our ticket to becoming affluent and everyone becoming affluent. There's another side to this moral economy of oil. There's an anxiety attached to it. What if we don't have oil? What if we lose access to oil? And that has also shaped politics and global politics and national politics profoundly. To kind of demystify this a little bit, instead of talking about Middle East or Latin American oil producers, let's look at France. France's engagement in Algeria, the bloody war that they fought, and it lasted far longer than the French elite should have figured it should last. But a large part of it was because of the oil newly discovered in the Sahara. And France was convinced, the French political elite were convinced that holding on to this energy after the defeat in the Second World War and the devastations of the Second World War would actually make France great again. So that was the slogan, making France great again, and through France making Europe great again. And a lot of this anxiety had to do with the Cold War era, which, where the US and Soviet Union basically controlled a lot of the, available oil resources. And Europe was in the process of rebuilding, through the Marshall Plan. And let's remember that the Marshall Plan, at least 10% of all the financial investments of the Marshall Plan were designated toward this shift from coal to oil as the major source of energy. So, oil was a huge component of it. Britain was kind of caught in the same types of anxiety over oil and control of oil resources, which is why it dug its heels and basically carried out the coup d'etat together with the US in 1953 in Iran. And a lot of the concerns that Britain had were slightly different. They had a lot to do with great debt that Britain was under, and their cash cow was the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which is now today is BP. At that point, 51% owned by the British government. And, the fear that the nationalization of AIOC would lead to a major crisis in balance of payments and would lead eventually to the collapse of of the sterling and the currency was a major factor in digging their heels and forcing a coup d'etat and not accommodating any kind of liberal nationalist attempts to for Iranians to control their oil. The U.S. likewise was, a lot of U.S. policies where, during the Cold War era were shaped by these anxieties over control of oil. And not necessarily just, in the context of the Cold War against Soviet Union, but against the rising tide of nationalism. Because nationalism was seen by the U.S. during the Cold War as the greater enemy, actually, than the Soviet Union, because it was internal. It was internal to a lot of the polities that were under the influence and the umbrella of the U.S. in the bipolar world of that era, right? The point is that the fears and the hopes that oil has engendered are not just limited, to the developing countries of the global south, but also, it's much wider than that. It's much more kind of widespread, and it should be criticized or analyzed critically as a global politics and as much more widespread than that. So there was the focus that I want to have, is on comparing what I called resource nationalism in the era that kind of predated 1980s in oil-producing countries of Middle East and Latin America, and the shift toward neoliberalism, which really has come with this critique of the role of oil, especially when it's publicly owned, after the 1980s, which is kind of really kind of enshrined in these theories of resource curse, and why this shift has happened. How did this hope of turning oil into a shortcut to modernity turn so sour after 1980s into its reverse images of and perceptions of failure, and that we were dealing not with the possibility of sowing oil for development, but as famously said by a couple of Venezuelan politicians, into devil's excrement. So I think the reason is, the reason for this shift is that if you recall, in the 1970s, there was a widespread with the Arab oil embargo, and U.S. being embroiled in the Vietnam War, and the other shifts that were taking place, which I can't really go into, but there was a shift toward nationalization of oil, which was quite widespread. In the Middle East as well as in Latin America, and OPEC really kind of became a major cartel, a major force on the global stage, with prices of oil increasing and so on and so forth. The reason for the turn away from the euphoria of the previous era to the current pessimism, and the view that oil is actually creating and causing authoritarianism or corruption and maldevelopment, quote unquote, I think is to just kind of like formulate it without being able to substantiate it, is that today's national oil companies basically operate exactly as the Seven Sisters or the international oil companies. The model of oil extraction, production, consumption has really not changed. The fact that the personnel, the technical experts, the people governing national oil companies, the ownership model is nationalized, is run by local nationals, has not changed really the way that these massive institutions are operated. And the way they operate is as opaque empires, which shape and engineer societies, territories, populations, shape development. But now, the transformation that has come about is that these national oil companies, and again, I'm really generalizing, it is really essential to my argument to actually look at case by case and actually trace the money, trace the expertise, to look at how territory property relations are being shaped through local politics. But if one wants to kind of generalize and extrapolate from this, the point is that these national oil companies basically reinforce, by and large, the existing establishments, the existing class relations, the existing geographies of extraction. They continue and replicate this possession and removal of people. Their labor regimes are actually quite similar, if not more oppressive, than the international oil companies. And the fact is that they shield the establishment, the political establishments, from oversight into how the political economy of oil is being operated. So let me just stop there, and that's the main point that I wanted to make. Thank you.
Arab, Syrian, Lebanese diasporas in Brazil and Argentina. So we work together comparing the two cases, which are very similar. So I'll be presenting a summary of the paper, of the argument. First, those communities, they were created in several waves of immigration from the Middle East since the late 19th century, but the bulk of the immigrants arrived before 1950. So we are talking really about diasporic communities. We are not talking about immigrants. We are talking about the sons, grandsons, and grand-grandsons of immigrants, and some immigrants, of course. But these communities, they are well established, well integrated in the host society. The other thing is that these communities also, they are not unified. They don't have homogeneous or unified identity to begin with. I mean, they don't have an overarching identity that all agree upon them. So some people call it the Arab community or Syrian Lebanese community, or you can talk about the Lebanese themselves or the Palestinians. So it's what I called kaleidoscopic identity. Several identities, they articulate together in different ways depending on the context. And in another context, some elements may disappear and other elements may appear. So, and that's very important to understand the dynamic of these communities. So one thing that called the attention is that the Syrian conflict created a strong political mobilization among the, I would call, Arab/Syrian Lebanese communities in both Brazil and Argentina. Of course, you had some precedents. I mean, those communities were always mobilized by issues related to the Middle East, for instance, the Palestinian question, or Lebanon. I mean, when there was the 2006 Israeli bombing of Lebanon, there were manifestations, protests by the community themselves, by the institutions of the communities. The opposition against the invasion of Iraq in 2003, it was also a moment of great mobilization, and also a moment where those communities received the support of a larger part of the host communities. I mean, left-wing parties participated. They always receive a lot of support from left-wing parties for all these causes. Other international issues or transnational issues created more regional or local forms of mobilization. For instance, the war on terror mobilized very much the Muslim communities in the tri-border area in Foz do Iguaçu and Ciudad del Este, because, of course, those communities were affected by both the discourses on terror and also the policies, the repressive policies that were created to control those areas. But in other areas of Brazil and Argentina, you didn't see very much mobilization around these issues. But all these mobilizations were different from the one related to the Syrian conflict. And there were three elements that were very important in the Syrian conflict. One, you saw the mobilization of the youth. You could see people of third, fourth, or fifth generation in Brazil who had no previous ethnic identity being mobilized and rediscovering their ethnic identity, especially their Syrian identity or their Arab identity, through this mobilization. And this was very different from the other moments of political mobilization, where you could see only people from first-generation immigration or second-generation at most, and actually people who were linked to the institutional life of the community. And here you saw people who had no connections either to the institutional life or even to any form of ethnic identity. The other thing was the dominance of pro-Assad discourses in the mobilizations. And that, we'll tackle that later. Of course, this doesn't mean that most people were in favor of the Syrian regime. It means that there was built a consensus around this kind of discourses. These discourses, they gained visibility while other discourses were being suppressed and erased from the ethnic scene of these communities. And one issue that was related to that was the small number of Syrian refugees in both Brazil and Argentina. You had until last year, 3,000 refugees in Brazil, which is basically nothing. And in Argentina, more or less the same thing. And those refugees, they had a very marginal role in the institutional life of the Syrian Lebanese communities. Of course, there were anti-Assad protests made by those refugees, but it didn't affect that much the narrative that was circulating within the Syrian Lebanese community. I mean, this was a very, let's say, marginal aspect of the whole mobilization around the Syrian conflict. So we'll be talking about the construction of this consensus, and of course this construction was very much performative. So in order to understand that, there are a few elements that must be taken into account. First, those ethnic institutions and some religious institutions also linked to the Syrian Lebanese community, they immediately mobilized authoritarian political imaginaries about Syria. They start portraying the Ba'athist regime as a secular, progressive, socialist regime that was resisting Israeli and American imperialism, and that's why it was being attacked by this huge conspiracy where Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the US to begin with were together trying to destabilize Syria in order to, of course, promote pro-Israeli policies or imperialist policies in the region. And these institutions, of course, they had historical links to those authoritarian political parties from the Middle East or transnational authoritarian political parties. For instance, the Qawmi-Suri, the Syrian Socialist Nationalist Party, was fundamental in the creation of many of these institutions, and still today many of the members and the directors and the elites that control these institutions was politically informed by the imaginary of this party. And the major overarching institution, FARAB, the Federation of Arab Institutions, was created by the Syrian government, with the sponsorship of the Syrian government, and has strong links with the Ba'ath Party. So of course, those institutions, they reproduce this kind of political authoritarian political imaginary and discourses pro-regime. Yeah? It doesn't mean that all institutions share the same imaginaries. You could hear in many institutions people saying, well, that's not like that. I mean, it's not true. Actually, it's a dictatorship in Syria and all that stuff. But those other opinions were always kept into private conversation. You could never see them being put forward in the public sphere. Already? That was fast. Okay, so you had several strategies of silencing dissident discourses. One of them was, of course, to keep them in the private realm. The other thing was personal pressure. So whenever somebody expressed some criticism to the Syrian regime or some doubts about the overarching pro-regime narrative, it would be silenced as pro-American, pro-Israeli, traitor, or someone who knows nothing about Syria, and so on and so on. Once I saw Syrian from Armenian origin saying, well, we lived with dictators in South America, that was not nice. Why do Syrians have to live with that? And immediately someone in the table said, well, so let the Armenians live with the Salafis, they will love it. Or all the Armenians should be stripped of their Syrian citizenship. We saved them from the Turks, and now they say that about us. So, and then that was the end of the conversation. Other forms of pressure, for instance, when the film festival in São Paulo was going to show the Silvered Water documentary about the Syrian war, several Arab institutions removed their support to the film festival. So you had all these kind of pressures. Other important thing was the sectarian mobilization of religious identities. So you had what I call sectarian agents traveling between Syria and Brazil and Argentina, especially Christian clergy coming. So there was a moment where the secretary of the Orthodox Patriarch of Damascus came to made lectures about the truth about Syria. And of course, those lectures, they promoted narratives of victimizations that pointed to the religious affiliation of Christian and Alawi victims, but erased the victimization of Sunni Muslims. The Sunnis were portrayed always as terrorists, as violent, as fanatics, with a point, in some lectures, people would say that no, the Syrian army never ever killed any civilian, and everything you see on TV was the bodies of Christians murdered by terrorists that the terrorists themselves put on display to say that they were murdered. So those sectarian agents promoted these narratives of victimization that allowed people to connect personally to the political framework of mobilization, and sometimes even diasporic imaginations were driven into that. In one of these lectures, one young man said, well, they even killed Brazilians in Homs. He was referring to the community of Brazilian returnees in Homs, and of course that allowed them to link directly as a personal tie, as an emotional tie between the diasporic condition and of course the horrors that were happening in Syria within this sectarian framework of mobilization. And finally, I think I have one more minute, many of the arguments put forward as a pro-regime defense had strong resonance with the vernacular anti-imperialist nationalism that exists in Latin America. I mean, both Brazilian and Argentinian nationalism is very much connected to anti-imperialist narratives, and of course anti-imperialism is anti-American, North American imperialism. So the idea that Syria was being the victim of American imperialism allowed the mobilization of many left-wing parties and giving the support to the pro-regime manifestations instead of giving support to the pro-revolution manifestations, but also allowed all those people from the fourth or fifth generation to combine their Brazilian and Argentinian identity with a rediscovered Syrian identity. Together, they articulated that as this anti-imperialist ethos or this anti-imperialist cause that they were fighting. And of course, in all those arenas, both the institutional, the religious, and the nationalist left-wing political arena, there were those strategies of silencing dissent. And when you were talking in these contexts of anti-imperialist discourses and all that, whenever someone would express doubts about it, that was really happening, an interesting concept would be put forward. They would ask, I thought you were in favor of the cause. And of course the cause is this vague political and moral concept that embraces everything. It's the anti-imperialist cause, the pro-Palestinian cause, the pro-Arab cause, the anti-Israeli fight, and all that. And that was a very effective way of silencing people. So in the end, one of the effects of all that was the reconstruction of diasporic Syrian identities, and Cecilia will talk about that.
Thank you, Paulo. I will just draw some conclusions.
Yep.
What I want to say is that what we were really interested in was understanding how this secular anti-imperialist narrative got intertwined with the secular aspect of the conflict. And in the end, I think that we can say that a large part of these anti-imperialist Latin American left has provided a secular legitimation to what we have described as a religious mobilization of these diasporic identities. There was something that I like to call a political red washing of those sectarian discourses. A red washing that ignored the complexities of the Syrian conflict and of course the anti-authoritarian dimension of the Syrian uprising, but mostly ignored the Syrian people itself. So what we witnessed was a transfer of the South-South solidarity, and I think it's very important to compare what I am describing now with the past memories of the South-South solidarities that our colleagues were mentioning this morning. A transfer of this South-South solidarity to the state instead of the people itself. And this shift was possible because in parallel, as you said, we have witnessed a reconstruction of the diasporic Syrian identities in Latin America with a strengthened sense of loyalty to the Syrian state as part of the diasporic Syrianness. In fact, the Syrian regime was able to impose this idea that the state is the nation, and making of loyalty one of the new codification of Syrian identity. And it also shaped new boundaries of Syrian diasporic identity, shifting away from the more traditional, cultural Syrian, Lebanese, and I would say more open identity towards a more narrow and politicized Syrianness. And I will just
Good afternoon. I'm going to talk about South-South solidarity and cooperation between South American and Arab countries. I would like to start by thanking the organizers and explaining for those who were here in the morning that I don't believe in the rise and fall of ASPA, because I understand this is part of a long-standing historic process and a series of deep connections that have reverberated between South America and Arab countries in different moments. I'd like to talk a little bit about these moments briefly. The first one, since Portugal and Spain colonized South America, bringing with them different aspects of the Arab culture from a hybrid culture into another one, as Benjamin Abdallah Jr., this great Brazilian author, explains. Second, through Muslim African slaves, since the 17th century, but especially in the 19th century, when the Arabic language played a major role in Brazil's history, because most of the Muslim African anti-slavery activists and revolutionaries wrote and spoke Arabic or Portuguese and African languages using Arabic letters in Ajami. As you know, the most important uprising against slavery in an urban context in the American continent took place in Brazil in 1835 and was led by Muslim Africans. And the third moment with the early waves of Arab migrations to South America in the late 19th century, as mentioned. Relations between Arab states and South America were built primarily on bilateral negotiations and agreements. Since early 2003, however, a new approach has developed that prioritizes an alternative model of international relations through bi-regional cooperation. Following his election in 2003, President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva traveled to 5 Arab countries, and Brazil launched a series of summits promoting political, economic, technological, culture, and educational cooperation with Arab countries. Although there are more than 16 million Arabs and their descendants in Brazil, the largest Arab community outside the Middle East, no Brazilian president had ever visited the region until President Lula in 2003. His was the first official visit of a Brazilian head of a state to any Arab country since the Emperor Dom Pedro II visited the region in the 19th century. In 2005, Brazil hosted the first summit of South American Arab countries, in Portuguese, Cúpula América do Sul Países Árabes, known by its acronym ASPA, which was intended to serve as a platform for the formulation and implementation of a common agenda between both regions. The response was encouraging. Commercial and cultural relations increased. Arab countries opened several new embassies and consulates in South America, and Brazil opened more than 20 new embassies in the Middle East and in Africa. Similar to the South-South vision laid out at the Bandung Conference, half a century before, participants envisioned the summit as a launching pad to coordinate positions as a unified bloc in order to influence organizations like the UN, WTO, and IMF. ASPA is one of the first mechanisms to promote cultural and educational cooperation from a South-South perspective of solidarity, recovering and valorizing epistemologies of the South, and to some extent, understanding that global social justice is not possible without global cognitive justice, as Boaventura de Souza Santos defends. In this process, intercultural translation is an essential tool. Some of ASPA's most significant accomplishments have been at the cultural level, and civil society-based cultural and research institutions have played a major role in this process. Both regions seemed to understand that cultural diplomacy could produce essential results in mobilizing domestic, regional, and international support for an emerging South-South solidarity. They also realized that cultural and academic initiatives could enhance political and commercial relations. Over the last 15 years, the Arab and South American Library and Research Center, Diaspora, has been promoting critical cross-regional reflection through the publication of books in Portuguese, Arabic, Spanish, English, and French, by creating and translating literary and social science works from one region to the other. To mention just a few of the books that have been translated: Mahmoud Darwish, Kanafani, Machado de Assis, João Guimarães Rosa. Those books are part nowadays of courses of departments that have been created, for instance, in the Middle East, departments of Portuguese language, of South American studies, and Brazilian studies. Also a website, and by organizing conferences, courses, debates, and the South American Festival of Arab Culture. Bibliaspa has been also promoting the teaching of language such as Arabic, Portuguese, and Spanish, and supporting non-Eurocentric ways of reading and interpreting. It also helps Arab, African, and South American refugees and migrants integrate into the society where they live. Brazil receives the most refugees in South America, the majority of whom are Arabs and Africans. Of course, if we don't consider Haitians as refugees, unfortunately, the UN doesn't see them as refugees, but there are in Brazil about 80,000 Haitians. And at Bibliaspa, every month, about 1,350 refugees receive free education, food, transportation, legal aid, psychological assistance, translation, and assistance in finding a job. An important achievement of ASPA is the establishment of research groups, to mention one: Arab, African, South American, and diasporic themes, narratives, and representations, which aims to promote the reading, analysis, and translation of key texts and manuscripts directly from the original language without an intermediate language. ASPA has also formalized spaces for networking among artists and scholars. An example of that is FICR, Journal of Arabic, African, and South American Studies, with an editorial board of professors from 25 countries. While ASPA's initiatives have produced significant results, they are limited by a lack of financing and an emphasis on trade. These limitations illustrate some of the challenges of South-South solidarity and cooperation. Difficulties are perhaps understandable. On one side, some Arab countries involved do not see the importance of supporting with practical steps educational and cultural initiatives related to ASPA. On the other side, South America has been facing political and economic crises, decreasing support for culture and education, and unfortunately, the current governments of countries like Brazil and Argentina, among others, do not see social, cultural, and educational programs as priorities. The turn to more conservative governments has made cooperating on ASPA-style initiatives more difficult. Today, ASPA's cooperation is weakened also by political and economic crisis in South America and by upheavals in the Middle East and North Africa. Challenges include the lack of financing for cultural education and research projects, an excessive dependence on chambers of commerce, which have expertise on its sphere of work, but not on society's culture and education, difficulties in realizing the importance of the refugees issue, and travel barriers and restrictions, among other factors. For the ASPA process to advance and for cooperation to be not just a momentary initiative, both regions need to continue building institutional frameworks and organizations, as well as to keep its original commitment to cultural and educational programs. This commitment includes providing adequate financing, institutional support, and the reactivation of dormant initiatives such as the ASPA UNESCO Contact Group that was established to formalize cultural cooperation with the UN, besides, of course, the obvious political will. Diaspora movement of rediscovery and of cultural valorization can allow the construction of alternatives enhanced by mutual understanding and critical reflection upon rich histories of linguistic, literary, commercial, and social development, partnership, and transregional exchange. For this movement to bear more fruits, it is necessary to face the mentioned challenges and provide support for initiatives related to research, publishing, education, and culture. Brazil and South America should consolidate and expand its relationship with Arab countries through a respectful and non-invasive dialogue, but one that should never concede ground in key areas such as human rights, freedom of expression, social inclusion, and the environment. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I had some relatively long written comments. Much of it was summarizing these excellent papers. But since you all heard them and the presenters did a great job of covering the many dimensions of their research and their essays, I'm going to not do the summary. But let me just begin by first thanking the organizers, Alejandro, Omar, and Sinan, for bringing us all together for a wonderful and very unique occasion, and having a series of speakers today and tomorrow who obviously have very deep knowledge of their region, multiple regions, have very analytically quite exhibit enormous dexterity, and have clear political commitments, specifically progressive political commitments. And the conference has gotten off to a great start, both in the morning panel and this panel that we just heard. As a collection, the essays illustrate how tracing political processes in parallel, as for instance, Paul Amar, let's call him the first Paul, illustrated, but also as Kaveh, Sunni, illustrated by the struggles of thinking about these, the oil complexes in parallel. But also the presenters, specifically our last two papers, grappled with not just these regions in parallel to one another, but how, by looking at how they intersect, open up new avenues for research and show us the limits of analytical frameworks, assumptions, and I like the expression that Paulo used, that it's kind of kaleidoscopic. Once you begin to look at one region through the lens of the other, you begin to see new shapes, new contours as well. As a collection, just like the morning panel, I think they also challenge us to think about the limits, or to use Paul Amar's term, the dark sides of South-South dialogue. I think something that we'll be continuously thinking about during the course of the next 2 days and hopefully beyond. So the South-South paradigm, not only is it challenging doing it in the, is it awkward doing it in English in New York City, in the North, but it also, once we begin thinking seriously about the multiplicity of Souths and the multiplicity of Norths, we have to grapple with various unintended consequences, dystopias, and shortcomings. So as I said, I'm going to skip over the kind of my brief summaries of the individual essays. We have a full house, and I'm sure I want to give plenty of time for you to pose your questions and contribute to our authors' thinkings about these issues. Let me just turn to some brief questions that the panelists can consider. They can address them if they like, or just take them on board. For the first two paper presenters, Paul Amar and Kaveh Ehsani, I was wondering if there are ways to think about both the oil complex, or the oil sector, oil industry, as well as, let's call it, the military security complexes in these regions from the lens of inter-elite collaborations or circulations of experts or would-be experts that are circulating and moving between Latin America and the Middle East, as well as possible nodes in the kind of global economy. I suspect both of you have done a lot more research and writing than beyond your papers, so I'm wondering if you could shed light on personalities, ideas, economists, lawyers, police sergeants, generals, militia leaders, and so on and so forth that pop up in one place or another. For Kaveh, I'm thinking about maybe Prebish. For Paul Amar, I'm thinking about the Colombians that my students that go to NYU Abu Dhabi tell me are quite prevalent in Abu Dhabi. Who are these Colombians, and so on and so forth. So if you could tell us about movements between these regions, that would be quite interesting. For Paul, just to add on, you discussed the kind of this notion of corruption in the Brazilian context, this kind of rather vague but extremely powerful discourse of corruption that moralizes politics and in a way chips away at state institutions. But you didn't at least get a chance to talk about how corruption or discourses of corruption manifest themselves in post-2011 Egypt. So I was wondering if you wanted to speak to that. Are there notable differences or similarities in the Egyptian case in terms of the discourse about corruption? And Kaveh, I wanted to ask you, give you an opportunity to maybe unpack this notion of control over oil. You give examples of coups and wars as ways of controlling oil. But could you tell us a little bit more about the specific institutional, legal, bureaucratic ways in which first these national oil companies and then maybe subsequently buyback contracts and joint venture projects also create forms of control over oil, maybe in ways that, with kind of a form of expertise, in a sense, create control. For Cecilia and Paulo Pinto, I have two questions. One is, if we begin actually with Paulo Farah's paper, and we wonder about, this leads me to wonder about the reaction or response of the Brazilian government and the Argentinian government and other governments to the Syrian uprising, and if you can, in a sense, contextualize these social movements, these debates within the, for lack of a better term, Arab communities in Brazil and Argentina. Are they also responding to their states, in a sense, public diplomacy or positioning and so forth? So if you could give us that. And second, as your case study or case studies and deep research illustrates, the mobilization in Brazil and Argentina is fundamentally shaped by social and political conditions in those countries, rather than what's going on in Syria in many ways. So this leads us to expect that there would be differences in other parts of Latin America, both South as well as Central America, if given that their conditions on the ground are somewhat different. So do you know of instances or cases in other parts of Latin America where Arab communities have mobilized in, for lack of a better term, let's call it pro-opposition modes and stances, or to pick up Cecilia's nice term, haven't red-washed Assad and so on and so forth? And if so, do you have any thoughts about possible variations along those lines? And last, but definitely not least, let me just raise a question for Paulo Farah. I wonder if you could shed some light on, your paper sheds light on some of the limited ways in which ASPA has kind of manifested itself. But could you go back to this founding moment, as you call it, this third or fourth, I forgot what moment it was, this moment which established this bi-regional kind of initiative, and tell us what was the motivations of these state actors, these agents, to actually go about creating this bi-regional association institution. And I'm asking you to do that in part. Are those motivations of these elites, for lack of a better term, does that shed light on the limits of this project, this particular manifestation of South-South solidarity making? So I didn't get a good sense of the initial motivations in 2003, if you could address that.
Thanks so much, Aaron. I think what we'll do now is just take maybe one round of questions from the audience, and we can just group them all together. Yep.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. Just going back to the theme of this conference, we know by definition where Latin America begins, where Latin America ends. But for the Middle East, it's Some scholars say that it's from Israel to Iran, but a lot of times in the media, other countries are kind of lumped into what could be the Middle East. So my question is in relation to resource nationalism, and specifically about Afghanistan, how there are numerous similarities between the countries mentioned, but also how much is taken from Latin American countries. I would say there are like 30-year-olds who are named Pele and Maradona. Those are not Muslim names. Or the song Lambada is played at weddings. You know, Lambada is a very famous Brazilian song. So there's a huge influence culturally, but also politically in Afghan politics, going back to Najibullah, the president prior to the Taliban regime. He met with Fidel Castro, and like a lot of those politics were involved. But for present day, for resource nationalism, comparing Afghanistan to Colombia, the opium trade in Afghanistan has definitely surpassed that of Colombia's. And just recently, the Taliban have acquired GMO opium seeds, which can produce opium year-round, and that production has taken off. But in the times of Pablo Escobar, he was able to build Medellin with drug money. You're not necessarily seeing that in Afghanistan. You're seeing a lot of the drug money helping build Dubai, right? So there's this movement helping build Dubai. A lot of the biggest drug retail or dealers, they don't keep their money within Afghanistan due to security reasons, so they're investing it outside of the country. So my question is, back to the reason of like Latin American versus East, that when it comes to natural resources, it is the rhetoric of Western societies that normalizes what is a commodity, like what can be taken as value. The saffron trade compared to Afghanistan and India, and Afghanistan and Iran,
Sorry, can we take
it's very profitable. So what is a commodity versus oil is valued more than the illegal trade of opium?
Thank you.
So thank you for the great panel. My question to Amar. Amar, I would love to hear from you about the relationship you're making today between the military economy and the violence, whether you will call it a structural violence or not, and how this would speak to the model of human security you have in your last book.
Very good question. So I found the conversation of how sort of anti-imperialist, anti-American national discourse served as a space for the reconstruction of a new diasporic identity really, really interesting and fascinating. And observing that same discourse is sort of this tremendously mystifying barrier to creating the kind of internationalism that's necessary now in the left to combat or resist the resurgence of right-wing populist militarism, not the least within the empire, within the U.S. I wanted to ask the panelists what possibilities or what opportunities they see for building that kind of internationalism, given the sorts of things that you're studying and observing.
Great, thank you. So we're going to start with the same order. Maybe Amar, you want to give it a shot?
Okay, great questions. Just start with Omnea. Right, in terms, how does the escalating social violence and also state repression of community movements, uprisings, there's, workers' movements, doctors' movements. Egypt is still an extremely dynamic, socially contentious polity. So I think that this shift towards a kind of military capitalism, political economy, is only one phase in a continuing, a very fractured kind of political and economic environment. I think that the original attempt of kind of the counter-revolution of 2013 and 14 was basically have Saudi Arabia come in and some other Gulf investors to try to kind of prop up a kind of Gulf-absorbed national capital scheme. And then eventually the kind of economic payoff for that, as well as the critique of a version of a kind of corruption discourse, seeing Sisi as selling out Egypt to the Gulf Arabs, which is based upon a long-standing Egyptian kind of civilization discourse of the Gulf Arabs being beneath them and dirty, and that's a whole other set of stories, and just jealousy about the rentier states of the Gulf also. But so the military then came in basically to take the place, in a more narrowly nationalist sense, to take the place of Gulf investors, but without introducing a kind of discourse of how that was going to benefit the people or the communities displaced by it, or offer even jobs, or offer any kind of agenda in an old-fashioned populist sense. So this new military populism in Egypt is very different from the Nasser era populism, because it really is basically taking the shell of a Dubai-like kind of money laundering and boondoggle project tossed over by the Gulf, infusing it with this version of military populism that is from another era, from the era of third worldism and Arab socialism, but without any of the people's content, without any of the redistributive ends. So that's why it does fit perfectly with the escalation of repression and social violence, because it's not a populist project, even in the narrowest sense. It doesn't have any aims for even cooptation or clientelistic connection to the people. And I think that's exactly what people were protesting even against the PT and the left in Brazil, is that the mega projects, the militarized and securitized mega projects in 2015 and 16 didn't have an actual popular redistributive impact. It only had a repressive and exclusionary impact. So, and how that relates to the security the human security state notion is human security state theory in the archipelago I offered as a description of how particular racialized, sexualized, exceptional subjects were created as a kind of prosthetic form of humanity that, as it expressed its emancipatory movement towards humanity, had to embrace a security logic, had to collaborate with police rescue and humanitarian militarism in order to liberate itself. And that opens the door to a revolutionary alliance with the military, but then the military can, of course, steal that legitimacy, and this new economy allows it to crush its popular alliance immediately. So it is connected. It's the fulfillment of the worst possible potential of the human security state. But that book also talks about the incredible positive potential of reversing that dynamic. So I'll talk too long, but I think that just very briefly on Arang's very good question about circulation is, in this case, there are, of course, a lot of interesting circulations amongst police trainers, and a lot of them are from Israel, El Salvador, Guatemala. I mean, Gabrielle, are you still around here? And also Paul Highgate has worked on a lot of those circulation of policing and military advisors that have a very familiar pattern from the counterinsurgency practices of the 20th century. But what I'm looking at now is specifically not the police and security actors with the typical profile. I'm looking at contractors around the builders of these mega projects. So it's kind of I think the laundering of debt and wealth through this combination of super glitzy boondoggle building projects and military legitimation with is something that's different from the circulation of actual counterinsurgency expertise and things, which is why this military capitalism doesn't have either a military logic or a populist logic. It's something wholly bizarre and new. We all have
Okay.
If we could just keep it brief so we can get another round.
Yeah. So going back to Arang's question about networks of knowledge and expertise in oil. I mean, I think this is a very interesting question. I think a lot of the technical and geopolitical knowledge about oil really developed very intensely in the interwar years, as oil was becoming a global, global knowledge. And Since then, I mean, if you look at institutions like OPEC, a lot of think tanks, you know, that you know, do things from market analysis to to production of technical expertise, they've actually become quite multinational and extremely, you know, vibrant. So you know, I know a few kind of commodities or fields that is kind of, you know, as intensely integrated, you know, globally as oil. And the really interesting thing about it is that how it is kind of profoundly closed off to social critique or any dialogue, you know, beyond the kind of like the very technical, very you know, kind of insular you know, barriers that they have. I mean, you know, try to see, you know, try to read the latest trade journal of, you know, McKinsey or even Mies. I mean, you know, you need at least like $1,500, $2,000, you know, subscription rate. You know, universities can't afford this anymore. It's very difficult to access this, but it's quite vibrant and it's interesting and it's very insular. Elaborate on control of oil. Look, I mean, this is a kind of a longer. It requires a longer answer than I can give. But let me just say this: that it's interesting that for all the anxiety surrounding oil, its deployment as a political weapon has taken place only twice, basically. You know, very briefly in 1973. In very shady ways. I mean, you know, the Arab oil embargo. I mean, you know, it didn't go that far. It was, it made a point. Its point was, you know, multifaceted. It really wanted to raise the price of oil, which it really succeeded. It, you know, paved the way for nationalization, power of OPEC, but it really kind of, it was limited and it was withdrawn, you know, after, it created a lot of reactions. And then Russia, you know, in case of using gas deliveries to the Baltic and to Ukraine, very briefly, and that was kind of complicated as well, you know, because these were like post-Soviet states that were in debt, in high debt, and they weren't paying, so it was a price war as well as a geopolitical move, which really kind of backfired for various reasons, right? The point I'm making is that if you look at it, if historically oil has really operated as a, you know, smoothly, regardless of what's happened. I mean, you know, the moments where control of oil has been kind of deployed as a weapon are more recent as sanctions, you know, as counter moves. Otherwise, I mean, you know, for all of Venezuela's tensions with the U.S., I mean, you know, the refinery operates. It has, you know, the distribution at a retail level really continues. The export goes on. Nobody wants to disrupt this, which is actually quite remarkable. You know, that it's impenetrable, the politics of it, and it's very kind of insular to social critique. So the big issue of control of oil is to what extent can different social forces, labor, you know, the poor, rural populations, locations, you know, provinces, areas which are kind of impacted by oil, by clear cutting in Ecuador, you know, in everywhere, you know, in the Persian Gulf, you know, where can they kind of make claims that, you know, what is being extracted should also benefit people, or maybe it shouldn't be extracted. You know, the kind of politics that you see, the social kind of, the kind of socially imbued politics that you see in a limited liberal way in Norway hasn't kind of really been enacted elsewhere. It really is it's an imperial, you know, network, global network that operates because everybody has a stake in it who's part of the political, global economic elite, you know. So that's something to kind of think about, you know, seriously. To the question about opium, look, I mean, it's, sorry, I don't want to take too long, just cut me off when I should shut up. But I think that, like, look, opium is not a natural resource, it's a crop, right? It's a very interesting question you're asking, you know, but I think the cases of opium and drugs have to do, you know, they're not extractive industries, they're agriculture. You know, they're crops, they're agriculture. And in both these cases, they're cash crops, you know, that can be done really quickly in mountainous regions that are not, you know, as easily accessible to surveillance. And they're taking place in wartime. You you know, because normal food production is not available, you know, because of this ongoing militarization of like the devastation that these wars are causing, which is a very important issue because those wars are part of a, you know, geopolitical, you know, residues of Cold War or, you know, or local trouble. So it's kind of important to kind of differentiate them. But the other side of your question, about these linkages, you know, horizontal linkages, for example, across Asia, you know, or, you know, globally between Latin America and the Middle East. I mean, there's a lot written about this, which is actually interesting, you know, from Amitav Ghosh's, you know, biographies, you know, autobiographies about doing field work from going from India to Egypt, doing field work and kind of rethinking all these linkages that existed that have kind of disappeared in the era of the nation states. To the more recent questions as to, well, who's calling this Middle East? I mean, this is like West Asia, you know? I mean, you know, there are all these migration routes that existed, you know, to the Americas, you know, a century before that. I mean, there's all these linkages that are kind of severed during the era of the nation states and empires. And in that sense, it's really important to kind of think really critically, you know, about this. That why, I mean, you know, Afghanistan and Iran, why is one Central Asia, the other one Middle East? And what is this construct called Middle East? It is rooted in oil. It is rooted in geopolitics. It's rooted in colonialism, British colonialism over India, and kind of reconceptualizing the Gulf as, you know, a barrier, you know, in the pre-war era. It was called this by an American naval officer who was kind of like rethinking that this is not the Near East, it's the Middle East. And it's kind of imbued with all these essentialisms, you know, because it's about Islam, you know, it's about oil, it's about patriarchy. This is how, you know, Middle East is being kind of conceptualized, limited, stereotyped, and so on and so forth. So it's a very important question. It needs to be asked and re-asked.
Well, I'll begin with your question, Alejandro, about the response of the Brazilian government. Yes, the thing is...
I think Arang. I don't want to credit for Arang's question.
Sorry. The thing is that this reading of the Syrian conflict and the Middle East itself cut across Brazilian society. So the official stance of not the Brazilian regime, but the Brazilian government was that, yes, Syria is being victim of some imperial, it had a civil war, and the only possible imperialist aggression could come from Europe and the US. So there is the famous speech of Dilma in Moscow in front of Putin, who was the only one to have troops in Syria at that time, to actually have some stance in Syria, saying that Brazil would not admit any foreign intervention in Syria. And he was smiling, of course, because the framework is that the only existing imperialism is North American or European. And another important thing to understand about Brazil is that anti-imperialist discourse is not just left-wing. The right, the extreme right, is very anti-imperialist, very anti-American. Where you see the most bizarre anti-American discourse and mythologies is in right-wing web pages in Brazil, where they think that Americans are stealing the Amazon, they will steal water, and our water resources are being mapped by the CIA, so this very unknown element called water will be taken from us and all that stuff. So in this sense, those communities, they were in the same pace as the Brazilian government. But Argentina...
No, I would say that it was the same in Argentina. I would go maybe even further. I think that the fact that these communities were able to mobilize and to speak out in favor of Bashar was precisely because there was a convergence of interest with the government. I remember that recently I was listening to the presentation of someone working on Syrians in Europe, and even though there are Syrian organizations that also support the regime, in Europe it's much more complicated to say it publicly. In Brazil and Argentina, it was possible precisely because there was already this political structure of opportunity. And as you said, Brazil is, its foreign policy is non-interventionist traditionally, for obvious reason. Latin America in general is non-interventionist. Brazil is part of the BRICS, so also the Russian influence on shaping foreign policy is I think it's more important than in the past. And regarding the second part of your question about if we can witness differences between Syrian Lebanese communities in Latin America, well, first of all, the patterns of immigration in all Latin America are pretty the same. They came at the same time. The religious composition of these communities are more or less the same. Even the social and economic integration are very similar. So all of this contributed to shape more or less the same views. And I think it's not only, I mean, maybe what we said, and we insisted on the local context in producing those discourses, but it's also transnational. I mean, the transnational agents that you were speaking about, Paulo, from Syria, and also on the South American level. FAIRAB, for example, is a Latin American organization. It's not only a Brazilian or an Argentinian one. It's Latin American. And because in Brazil and Argentina you can find the largest Syrian Lebanese community, I think that they serve as a reference for the rest of the communities. I conducted some field work in Chile, and they look at what, you know, the Syrian in Brazil and Argentina say. It's more, I used to work on the Palestinian diaspora in Latin America, and you can find the same thing. Chile is the reference because it's the largest community. So what the Chilean Palestinians say serve as a reference. So unfortunately, or not, it depends on your opinion, but there is no major differences between the communities in Latin America.
Just to complete something, of course, it's not just local, it's this interaction between local and transnational, which is very interesting because not everything, of course, worked. The Syrian government tried to mobilize the Syrian diaspora in Latin America since 2004 when they created the Ministry of the Expatriates. And of course, there was Bashar visit to Brazil, and to their surprise, it was a failure because there was no clear-cut Syrian identity, which is being created now because of this factor. So
in what sense was it a failure?
Because you could not find Syrians to begin with. I mean, Syrian identity, unlike Lebanese diasporic identity in Latin America, it was very much linked to pan-Arab nationalism. So they would define themselves as Arabs in general, or Syrian Lebanese. So the idea that they would have some kind of personal link to the Syrian state was very remote for them. So they could not really mobilize. But nowadays, you're having this clear-cut Syrian identity emerging from this more general Syrian, Lebanese, Arab, whatever. So these transnational connections, they have to resonate in some way with the. So you had people from fourth generation Syrian that they say, oh, I'm an Arab, but whatever is that. They would not feel as. And to answer the other question of the anti-imperialism as an arena for reshaping diasporic identities, in this case that's clear. But of course, the second part of your question about militarism is very complicated. Which militarism? Because what's happening, of course, you have all this discourse of confronting North American militarism, but there is this great silence against Russian or Iranian or Hezbollah intervening in the Syrian conflict. So the problem with these arenas is that they are highly selective, according to some ideological leanings or political connections or transnational connections. So that would be my answer.
Before answering my question, just wanted to add that Brazil approved special resolutions for any Syrian that wanted to become a refugee in Brazil to go, but it didn't offer the necessary infrastructure. So when we work with refugees, sometimes we ask them, why did you choose Brazil? And they would say, I went to 10 or 15 different embassies. All of them refused my visa, and then Brazil just told me, you just have to sign here and you can go to Brazil. And once they arrive in Brazil, of course, the situation is terrible because there's no infrastructure offered to them. And something similar happens to African refugees because they know the majority of the population in Brazil is black, and they think maybe because of that there would be no racism, and of course because of the external discourse of the Brazilian government and so on. And once they arrive in Brazil, they discover that's a totally different situation. To answer your question, I think we have to look at the internal and the external context. So the motivations for the strengthening of this South-South solidarity, if we think about the internal context, I have to explain that historically, the elite in Brazil and in South America in general has denied the importance of Arabs and Africans in the history. So it was totally against what the elite would expect and until nowadays. So if you see in the media and in different places, they're always against this presence of Arabs and Africans. There's always this Eurocentric and white way of seeing things. And also internal, we have to think that I don't believe it's a coincidence that in the last 4 elections in Brazil, all the candidates were in favor of the strengthening of South-South solidarity. Of course, you're not talking about the present head of state, because he was not elected, but I'm talking about the heads of state that were really elected. And all of them had a discourse in favor of South-South solidarity. It's also important to say that President Lula da Silva, in 2003, when he was elected, he received all those movements, the black movements, the Arab movements, the different movements of resistance. And he sent a lot of scholars to travel around South America. And in the very first day of his government, he approved a law, the law 10,639, that made the teaching of African history and culture compulsory at schools. And then there was another law, 10,645, that improved this law. And so until nowadays, so in the last 15 years, I could definitely say that when we talk about African culture and the perception of Brazilians to Africa, it is changing. Of course, it's a long process and there's a lot of things to do, but so we have to see this broader context. And the context is there was definitely a different approach towards South-South solidarity. If we think about the external context, international relations, of course, they were trying to increase commercial relations, military relations, and so on. But there was also a different trend in international relations. And I would definitely commend the book written by the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Celso Amorim, who talks about the difference in the foreign policy of Brazil, which he called altiva and ativa, the proactive and the high foreign policy. And that helps to explain as well how Brazil was looking in favor of this strengthening of relations with Arab countries and with African countries. And just to finish, just wanted to mention that similar to this mechanism of cooperation between Arab countries and South American countries, there was another mechanism called ASA between African countries and South American countries.
Well, let's thank our panelists. Thank you so much. Just a couple quick points. We do have a coffee break right now out in the lobby. Since we're running a little bit late, I think that we'll just convene the third panel at 3:45. So 15 minutes later, so you have a half an hour to stretch your legs. The next panel is on mapping solidarity. So this question of the fraught nature of solidarity between South-South is at the center of this panel. And finally, tomorrow, we do have an hour reserved for just a plenary discussion, right? So that will be an opportunity for questions that have not been posed to be hashed out there. So thanks so much.
No, you said 30-minute break. 30 minute.